Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. It's raining outside, it's a rather ugly day, but there is sunshine in my heart and I am about to tell you why. A few months ago I learned that a new book by Yasunari Kawabata was going to be published this month. I was ecstatic when I learned about this, especially when I heard that it was going to be a novel that had never appeared before in English or Spanish or French or any of the languages that I can read. So I ordered the book before it was even published, and let me tell you, this is something that I rarely do, but we are talking about Yasunari Kawabata here, okay? He is my favorite Japanese author, as I have said before in another video, and I have read every single thing by him that I could find in those languages that I was telling you about before. So the book arrived a couple of days ago, and 24 hours later I had already finished reading it, which for me is like, unthinkable. I absolutely loved it, and here I am about to share my thoughts on it with you, my friend. So let's look at this book, The Rainbow. I have my copy here and I just wanted to show you the cover because it looks really nice. This was originally published in serial form. Started in 1950 up to 1951. So in a couple of years, the whole thing was published. So if you look at those years, right, 1950, 1951, that means that this novel is contemporaneous with The Master of Go, Thousand Cranes, The Sound of the Mountain. So really, really important books. The best novels that Kawabata ever wrote, according to most people. The novel is 215 pages long, and the text is divided into 14 chapters that to me appear to be the installments of that original serial publication. So this is a longish novel, actually, if you compare it to other books by Kawabata. It is a little bit longer than Snow Country. It is shorter than The Sound of the Mountain, which I think is his longest novel. It's basically just about as long as Beauty and Sadness, so just to give you an idea of how long it is. And speaking of form, one thing that I was struck by as I was reading it was the prominence of dialogue. I feel, from what I remember, that there is quite a bit more dialogue here in The Rainbow than in the typical Kawabata novel. So The Rainbow is primarily the story of two sisters, Asako and Momoko. And they have the same father, okay, but different mothers. So the figure of the father is also important. We have these two women and then Mizuhara, who is their father. Mizuhara, by the way, is his last name. So the story really revolves around Asako's desire to find and to meet a third sister, who is, their father's daughter also, but by a different woman. So we have a man here, Mizuhara, who was involved with three different women, and these are the sisters that you have at the center of the novel. Asako and Momoko's father, Mizuhara, is an architect. And at one point, business takes him to the city of Kyoto. So he asks his daughters to accompany him. And of course, he has his motives for doing that, personal motives other than business. But most of the novel, because of that, takes place in the city of Kyoto. I think the best way to approach this novel, The Rainbow, is by looking at the characters. So I already told you a little bit about Mizuhara. He's an architect. He is the father of these women with different mothers. And I think the main focus here is on Asako and Momoko throughout the novel. And I have really a hard time figuring out which one of them is the protagonist. That's a question for you if you decide to read the novel. Who is the protagonist here? So let me tell you a little bit about these two characters. Asako is the gentle daughter. She is the proper one. She is also the legitimate one. So her father married her mother, whereas the other women that you can see in Mizuhara's life, they were lovers. So that is a big difference right there culturally. Her father has just great affection for her. At one point he even tells her, "I would like to build a house for you." He does not say that to Momoko at any point, and he does not have that desire in relation to any of his other daughters. So that's Asako. On the other hand, we have Momoko, and she is dark, she is melancholy, jealous, resentful. I would even say she is sadomasochistic, the way she is presented. And there have been many men in her life. She's a bit of a man-eater, I guess you could say. And we see her interacting with a lot of men in the novel, but there is one man who particularly left an impression in her life. This is somebody from her past. Okay, so before the events that we read about in The Rainbow, she was involved with a man, her boyfriend, who died in World War II. So the action of the novel takes place right after World War II, and the war is just present right there, especially for Momoko in the figure of this boyfriend who died in battle. So the novel begins by focusing on Asako. Definitely. She is there in the first scene. But then when you look at the last scene of the novel, she is not present there. And instead we have Momoko. So there's a shift right there. It's very interesting in the structure of the novel. I'm not surprised at all. I'm not going to say I'm surprised because this is Kawabata. And Kawabata usually does things like that with structure. He does not really subscribe to the typical structures that you can find in the novel. So that is something beautiful about him that you are going to find also in The Rainbow. As I read The Rainbow, I kept trying to think of connections with other novels. I could not help this because I have read all of Kawabata's novels. So I was trying to see, how does this compare? What connections can I find? And one example, the first one that I thought of, the first chapter of The Rainbow, what we have is strangers on a train. We have an encounter there on a train. They see a rainbow. Asako is there with a man named Mr. Otani, who is going to become important as the novel progresses. So because of this idea of the train and the strangers meeting there, I thought of Snow Country, inevitably. Also, the young woman's father, right? He goes to Kyoto. He's the architect because he has a job there. He is going to design a tea room for one of their acquaintances. So just because of that, right? The idea of Kyoto and the tea room and the tea ceremony, it made me think of Thousand Cranes, which, as you know, has the tea ceremony at its center. And then, of course, because most of the story takes place in Kyoto, I could also not help thinking about the old capital, the title of which originally was Koto. So you see, there are many connections here. I like the setting, okay? I like the setting of Kyoto because due to that setting, you get a lot of descriptions of beautiful things. For example, temples. For example, flowers. They go to see the cherry blossoms. It seems that that is something that cannot be missing in a Japanese novel of this time, at least. There's a connection right there, maybe with the Makioka sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki. But I wanted to mention The Old Capital in particular. I think that is the novel with which I connected The Rainbow the most. I did a video on that if you're interested, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that because there is that other video that I can refer you to if you're interested in more details about that great novel by Kawabata that does not get a lot of attention, The Old Capital. One thing that I wanted to do in this video is to highlight three themes for us. And the first one that I want to focus on is beauty. I like to think that there's a title of one of my favorite novels by Kawabata, which is Beauty and Sadness, and I like to think that that could be the title of his complete works. If I put together a book, the complete works of Yasunari Kawabata, the title would be Beauty and Sadness. It's just perfect, okay? And you can find these two concerns throughout his works. Asako's father, for example, is inspired to build a house for her when he becomes aware of her beauty while they are taking a bath together. So there you see the concept of beauty. But this beauty is present not only in human beings, but also in nature. Let me give you an example here of a saying that one of the characters shares with us. This is on page 119. And the saying is, "The beauty of a single flower is enough to reawaken one's will to live." So you get the sense that these characters are looking for beauty because beauty is that little push that we need sometimes, when we're going through a tough time. And I think this is what, I get from some of the novels by Kawabata, that when you see a character that is suffering in many of his novels, and especially in this one, sometimes the problem is that they cannot find, or they are unable to perceive the beauty in life, right? At best, you could say that maybe this is a symptom of their unhappiness, but that is definitely something that is present there. When somebody is unable to find beauty or unable to perceive it, that's when things become problematic for them in the world of Kawabata. The second theme that I wanted to talk about is the fragility of life. There's one theme that I absolutely love and that I was really happy to see reflected in this novel, and that is the idea or the concept of the ripple effect. This is present in The Rainbow, and it was a surprise to me. So let me give you an example. In one moment, Momoko says something to Asako that is really, really cruel and really ugly. Let me share that with you. This is on page 134. So Momoko says, "It's the strangest thing. If my mother had killed father, you would never have been born. Would you? And it would have been the same outcome if my mother had married him instead. It makes you wonder." So think about that, saying that to your sister or half-sister. And Asako is well aware of this. Another thing that Momoko is aware of is the fact that the only reason why she is alive at this point in the novel is because her mother did something. I'm not going to reveal what, because I want you to have the experience of the novel, but because her mother decided to do something, she is alive at this moment, and she's very aware of how fragile her situation is. It's this idea that sometimes, there's that whole experience that we have, our whole existence is just dependent upon this tiny or not so tiny decision that somebody made, this trifle, as they call it in the novel. And of course, Momoko is well aware of that, but we have a sense of that through the narrator also, throughout the novel of the rainbow. And finally, for the third theme that I would like to share with you, I'm going to borrow a phrase, the title of a song by Ronnie James Dio, which is Rainbow in the Dark. If you have not listened to that song, I urge you to do that, because it's a really good one. I am always struck by the cruelty of Kawabata's characters. Okay, this is something that, it's not a cruelty that is completely, graphic, but it's a very subtle type of cruelty most of the time. But let's put it this way: after reading a Kawabata novel, you do not feel exactly like placing your entire trust in human beings. Let's just put it that way. If you hear a sound, that's my cat breathing. My cats come to my room whenever the weather is ugly outside. They have that comfort, I guess, from being here. So as I was saying, you don't feel exactly like trusting human beings after reading a Kawabata novel, and the rainbow is no exception here. In this novel, Momoko is the one who reflects that cruelty, but there are also other characters who display it too. One example would be Keita. That is her boyfriend, the one who died during World War II. One thing that he would do, for example, was that right before seeing Momoko, he would spend time with prostitutes, and then he would tell Momoko about it. So, you know what I mean? It's that type of cruelty. As I said, it's not graphic, it's not physical, violent cruelty, but that psychological, sadism that you find in these characters in Kawabata novels. But at the same time, and this is what I was saying, there's that rainbow in the dark. There is a ray of hope most of the time. At least in the rainbow you find it, which makes sense, right? Because we have that image, right? That symbol of the rainbow at its center, right? At the center of the story. As the story begins, when Asako is on the train with Mr. Otani, they see this rainbow, but it's a winter rainbow. So she's wondering, does this mean, is this a good omen? If it's a winter rainbow, usually it has to be a spring rainbow in order for the omen to be, unequivocal, to be something that this is going to be good, it's going to be a good year. But this is a winter rainbow, so there's a little bit of a difference there. And then at one point, Asako finds herself in the hospital. And on the wall, she has a reproduction of Millet's painting Spring, which features a rainbow in the corner. So here you have two examples, two rainbows in the novel. The first one, the one that she sees on the train, connects her to the future because she is wondering if this is a good omen. And the other one, the painting that she has in her hospital room, connects her to the past because that was a favorite painting of her mother's. So she has this emotional connection with the mother through the painting. But in any case, whether it is future or whether it is past, we are really talking about hope ultimately, because the rainbow is a symbol of hope. I wanted to share two quotes with you because I think they are important, and I thought that would be a good way to illustrate the contents of this novel and some of the ideas that you can find. The first one is from page 105, and this has to do with a very important scene between Momoko and Keita, the guy who died during World War II. At one point he makes a mold of one of her breasts in order to make a silver cup to drink from. And this is something that we read here, 105. Taking a mold of her breast to fashion a silver tea bowl had seemed to her at the time an unreal fantasy. But she knew now that a man and a woman in love were capable of all manner of inexplicable things. A silver tea bowl in the shape of a breast was perhaps a tangible manifestation of his immature sentimentality. One thing I love about Kawabata's characters, or about some of them, is those moments where they interpret things. They give you their insight into things. And it's so fresh. It's not what I would have thought of if I had seen this silver cup or anything like that. But it's just fascinating how they read things, right? How they read the world around them. And then there's the other quote that I wanted to share with you, which is on page 190, has to do with Kawabata's life. Let me share this with you. It has to do also with the concept of last words. So I wanted to give you that idea there to kind of place this in some kind of a frame. Momoko knew that the words left by those approaching death were often no more than deceit. than ostentation, than deluded attempts to adorn oneself in an imaginary reality. All life, both animal and plant, was destined to perish without leaving lasting words, just like the stones and water. This concept of lasting words, the final words, I could not help thinking this was a very eerie moment for me, because I could just not help thinking about Kawabata's death. There is that debate, did he commit suicide or was it an accident? But one of the things that people always mention is the fact that he did not leave a note. And that is what makes people wonder as to what happened, or maybe there's the possibility that it was an accident. But when we read this and connect it to what happened in Kawabata's life, this idea that he seems to be here against the concept of leaving last words, because that is a sign of ostentation. I just thought that was a moment that made me pause. I was reading this and I was like, okay, I needed to take a break. I closed the book and I thought about this. And I immediately thought about Kawabata's life. And I could not help, getting that feeling there as I read that. So some final thoughts, the bottom line. Is the rainbow Kawabata's masterpiece? Of course not. I don't think anybody is expecting that at this point. Okay, we have his masterpieces and his best novels, but I'm going to say this, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And you can tell by the fact that I was able to read it in such a short time. Usually a book like this would probably take me about 3 days or something like that. But this time, I'm telling you, I came back from work, I was really tired. The book had arrived the next day, the day after it was published. And I started reading it and I could not stop. I kept going and I finished it the following day. So it was just such a joy, to get a translation by Kawabata at this point. And this is not one of those unfinished novels that publishers sometimes find, but it's really a complete work, a novel. And it is a novel from the time that Kawabata was publishing his masterpieces, his best work. So it really reflects that. It really reflects that this is a writer at the height of his powers. If you're a fan of Kawabata, you are going to read it, so I don't even need to tell you anything. But if you're not a Kawabata maniac, like, this guy that you're listening to, the question is, should you read it? And I would say definitely. I definitely recommend it, even if you have read one book by Kawabata, or 2 or 3, or even, if you have not read this author. This is a novel that I believe you're going to enjoy, because it really has his style at its best. Okay, the characters also are just human. They are fantastic. They're just absolutely well developed. And finally, another thing that you're going to find here is the ending, that exquisitely understated ending that Kawabata is known for. So I would say that all of the elements that make Kawabata a great author are present in The Rainbow. Though, keep in mind that, of course, this is not really his masterpiece, but it's really, really a very good novel that I believe you are going to enjoy. And since we are talking of rainbows and maybe the possibility of me seeing one at one point today when the sun finally comes out, I wanted to recommend to you something that has absolutely nothing to do with anything except for the title, and that is the music of Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. I kept thinking of this band while I was reading the novel, not because it has anything to do with the text or anything like that, but because I love this band and I hadn't listened to it in a very long time. So I'm going to take that, opportunity right there with that connection with the title to go back to this. I have the very best of Rainbow here. It's a good selection because they went through many, or at least 3 different phases, or maybe 2 phases with one transition album right there. But anyway, that's another story. So definitely check out The Rainbow if you have not read Kawabata. I recommend that you start with maybe Snow Country and then move on to my favorite novels, which are The Sound of the Mountain and Beauty and Sadness. But he's a great author, and I just love, I'm just so happy that we have had this opportunity to read another work by him. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Yasunari Kawabata's The Rainbow. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.